Okay. Okay, so looks like a bunch more people found it. We'll wait about another minute and then I'll start. I think we're just about up to the numbers we had on the other stream, almost. Just how rebirth works. One old stream ends and the new one pops up. Yeah, I kind of like that. Okay, I think we're good to go. Looks like people found the location. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, so I thought I'm going to do something a little bit out of the box today and indulge in a bit of speculation, my own thoughts. Something I've actually been thinking about for a while, and it's given me an opportunity to kind of put it into words. Thinking about the evolution of life and humanity on this planet, and what we can glean from the Buddhist teachings to help us understand that. Now, we do have the Aganya Sutta, which I've been over. It's a very interesting text, and I've been over it in different talks many times. It's the sutta that deals with the origins of humanity, and to put it in a nutshell, the Abhisara Brahmas, some of them descend to the earth at the time when the earth is just in formation, and they become curious about the foam they see on the ocean. It's called oja, nutritious foam, and some of them taste it, and that by tasting it, they fall to earth and take on a coarse body, and through several stages of devolution, they lose all their divine characteristics and become humans. One obvious omission in this sutta is there's no discussion at all about how animal species arose on the earth. So that is not discussed. So we'll just have that as the background. That's really a main source for Buddhist thinking about origins. Stepping out from there to the discourse in the world, for some time now, the two main schools of thought that deal with origins of life and species and humans are creationism, or its more modern variant, intelligent design, and the other is a strictly mechanistic, materialist approach that's called Darwinism, or the modified form Neo-Darwinism, whose primary tenet is, first of all, there's no teleology in evolution, meaning there's no directed end goal. Everything just happens by chance, and the evolution works by random mutation and then selection from the mutations of the fittest. Now, both of these theories, there could be correlated with the two extreme views in the Buddhist discourse. When the Buddha is talking about wrong views, the simplest and most pared down approach is to see the two extreme views of materialism and eternalism. or in the Pali language, Uchedawada, Sasatawada. So obviously Darwinism would be the materialist view, the Uchedawada, and intelligent design or creationism would be Sasatawada. The Buddha always said his view is the view of dependent origination, the view in the middle that takes a stand on dependent origination, cause and effect. And the two extreme views deny causality at some point. In the creationist view, everything goes back to the arbitrary will of the creator. And in the annihilationist or materialist view, everything ends up depending on randomness. And in the dependent origination teaching, there is no randomness, there is no arbitrariness. Everything arises from causes and conditions. So with that for background, let's consider there are a few juncture points in the history of life on this earth. And I think we have to, from an evidentiary point of view, we have to take the geological and fossil records as a given and work from there. There are a few juncture points that modern science finds very difficult to explain. And these are often seized upon by the creationists to justify their thinking. But creationism has different kinds of problems as well. The very first moment that modern materialist science has difficulty explaining, or is really impossible to explain, is the causality behind the origin of the universe itself. If the Big Bang cosmology is correct, there's a couple of problems with the explanation. One is what is the cause behind the Big Bang? There's one physicist, I can't remember the name, but there was one physicist who is quoted as saying about this, he says, "Give me one free miracle and I can explain the rest." So there is a kind of creationist, the hidden creationist agenda behind the Big Bang. Maybe not an agenda, but a subtext behind the Big Bang, that somehow there was an origin, and then you try to explain the unfolding of everything from that point. But that's not the end of the difficulty, because if you have a purely mechanistic unfoldment of the laws of physics from the moment of the Big Bang, there would be a uniform expansion from the initial point. And it's very difficult, or if not impossible, to explain why that didn't happen. It should have been just a uniform soup of subatomic particles. Instead, we see clumping into planets and stars and galaxies and so on. They call this the breaking of the symmetry. So this is all, the very origin is very mysterious, and the Buddha himself said we cannot know it. There's no amount of speculation will ever explain the ultimate origin of things. But some of the later texts in the commentaries, they lean very heavily towards the view, and Buddha goes actually explicitly states that the universe is without beginning, infinite in both directions of time. So if you go backwards in time to any given moment X, there has to be a moment X minus 1. And this is a logical extension from the dependent origination. Because if you allow a first beginning, then you allow something outside the laws of causality. So any given moment has a previous moment as a cause for its arising. But any given world system, including multiple world systems in clusters, which we might call galaxies, um, has a beginning and an end. And the explanation given in the commentaries for why a world system re-arises after a long time after it's been destroyed is not a creator God. It's the force of the karma of all the beings who perished in the old world system. Because again, dependent origination, if beings die and prior to being fully enlightened, then they die with karma and desire still outstanding, and the force of consciousness causes them to take a new rebirth. But if the universe has been destroyed and there's no place for them to be reborn, then the collective force of all the beings generates new world systems for them to come into existence. So this would be a Buddhist explanation of the ultimate origin of what we call the cosmos and universe. And that's pretty explicit in the text, at least in the commentaries. You know, that's not my speculation. But now we're going to get a little bit deeper into the woods with the next one, which is the first origin of life, not just human life, but life in general. The first origin of life on this earth. Now that too is something that is admitted to be a completely unexplained mystery by modern science. That they've done a lot of work on it, and it just gets more puzzling the more they look into it. Because for self-replicating life to exist, there's so many complex structures that must work together that it's impossible to really come up with a model of how it could arise gradually and step by step assembling of parts, because it would just dissolve before it becomes a complete cell. You actually need a complete cell to be self-replicating, which means you need, first of all, nucleic acid, you know, DNA and RNA, although you could possibly get by with just one of those. And you need proteins, complex proteins, to form amino acids. And you need them all to harmonize and work together. You need a cell wall, you need ribosomes to replicate the proteins. So this is a whole complex structure. So this again is the creationists point this out as a flaw in the materialist view. You know, one of the creationist writers or intelligent design writers, who said if a random assembly of a cell from a soup of amino acids, which may have existed in the early Earth, that may be the Oja, by the way, then that's like imagining a tornado going through a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747. And it's not a bad analogy. I may get back to problems with the creationist view later, but it seems to be the case that something other than purely mechanistic processes is needed to explain the first origin of life. That the Earth at one point was devoid of life, and there may, by inorganic processes, you may assemble some amino acids, and that's about as far as it can go. That somehow we have working living cells. So something else is required. And what's left out of the mechanistic model is mind. So Now, here's I'm going to get into some speculation about how the mechanism of this might have worked. And in a way, it's an action. It's acting from mind outside of that system of the earth. It's an action. It's acting from mind outside of that system of the earth system, uh, tinkering with materiality to create the first life. Up a bit, I'm seeing it sort of shuddering. I hope this holds out. Okay, so going back to the first arising of the universe by the force of karma, the way it's said to arise is from the top down. So you first get the higher Brahma worlds, and then one by one, each lower level appears. You know? So you have the 4 Brahma levels, and then you have the sensual Deva levels appearing. So from the top down, the second Deva level to appear would be the Nimanarati Devas, the Devas who delight in creation. They, with the power of their mind, they can create any forms in their realm that they wish. They can manifest any sort of objects or vehicles, mansions, whatever they wish in their realm. And this is their delight and their play. Now, how could this work? If we want to try and explain it in what we now understand about the physical universe, it could be that they have a very advanced power of collapsing the wave function. Reality, according to quantum mechanics, reality exists as a probability field. And at least in the Copenhagen interpretation, it requires an observer, which can be interpreted as consciousness, to collapse the wave function into a resolution, to a mathematical resolution, which falls according to the highest probability. So in the macrocosmic world, the world of objects that we recognize, this effect is not really observable, because we're dealing with trillions and trillions and trillions of subatomic events, and the probabilities falling on average in predictable ways. Then we have the Newtonian laws of physics manifesting. But at the quantum level, the subatomic level, any individual particle is subject to that probability function. So particle A, let's say an electron or a photon, has the highest probability of appearing at point X, but the probability of appearing at point Y is not 0. And it only can be said to be at X or Y once it's measured, it is observed. So these Nimanarati Devas, and perhaps also in their, it may be besides their power of their mind to collapse the wave function as very powerful observers working on a macroscopic plane, it may be that the probability field in their realm of existence is much more fluid, it's much more open, it's not such a steep curve, so that they have a very much more fluid medium to work with, and they collapse from that field, they collapse any objects they want, so they manifest things. An Eastern way of saying it would be they manifest out of the void various objects from the full emptiness of the pregnant void. They collapse discrete objects. So this realm would be consisting of many individuals, and the individuals may have different proclivities and interests. And some of them may be interested in very elaborate artistic creations, for example. And some of them may be looking for challenging forms to create. And here I'll speculate that as the lower realms began to manifest and come into existence, maybe some of these Niminarati Devas took an interest in the earth as it was forming. And they saw that the materiality of the earth was coarser, the wave function was harder to manipulate, but they still they still persisted, thinking it was an interesting challenge. They wanted to play with forms on the earth. And it may be that they found it easier to manipulate this coarse matter on a very fine molecular level rather than large discrete objects. So they would probe down deeper into small microscopic structures, which would make sense. There would be less diffusion in the field. And perhaps they took it up as a intellectual or artistic challenge to try and create self-replicating structures, the little toys, automatons that would carry on their own, working with this coarse, gross matter. And this might be the first cells and the first Precambrian organisms. Prior to the Cambrian period, which I'm going to touch on next, prior to the Cambrian period, there was life on the earth, but it was at a very simple level. Either one-celled organisms or very primitive, very small multicellular organisms with very little diversion, all kind of like tiny worm-like creatures. Maybe, I'm just here, I'm into the speculation within the Niminarati Devas. It may be that these were the kind of toys or automatons created by the Niminarati beings. So they wouldn't have had consciousness, they wouldn't have had karma. They would be the kind of psychic equivalent of plants in our era. According to Abhidhamma, plants have life, but not consciousness or karma. So this may be as far as they could go with manipulating matter. And then for many tens of millions of years, probably hundreds of millions of years, the life on the earth continued in that simple manner. And by the metabolic manner, and by the metabolic processes of the life, they were changing the chemical constituents of the seed, and may have applied. There may have been some mutations and selection among them, but it didn't go anywhere. They still remained at that very primitive level for a very long time. And then the next juncture point is what's called the Cambrian explosion. It happened about 500 million years ago. And this has been a puzzle to evolutionists for a very long time. Darwin actually was known in his time, and he wrote about it as being very difficult to explain. And it's still a mystery, and there's a lot written about it, but no one's really convincingly explained why this happened. But about 500 million years ago, in a geologically short period of time, there was an explosion of different life forms. There's something like I think it's like 30 or 40 phyla of animal life on the earth now. A phyla is the largest division of animal kind, so it'd be like vertebrates, arthropods, annelids, mollusks. These are phyla. So they're groups of animals that have very radically different body plans, and it's difficult to imagine intermediate forms between them that would be viable. They're like independent, separate streams of life. And the thing is that most or possibly all of these phyla arose at this time, this narrow window of time in the Cambrian explosion 500 million years ago. So you go from these a few simple worm-like things to arthropods and vertebrates and mollusks and all the rest, radically different life forms. And this radiation of phyla occurred only once in our planet's history. The phyla continue to develop, and the individual phyla, they continue to develop and diverge, but staying within their own lane, so to speak. And once the vertebrate form had arisen, you have variations on it, like fish and reptiles and birds and mammals, but they all have the same basic body plan of a central nervous system. Likewise with arthropods, you have multiple legs and an exterior skeleton and so on. And you can endlessly vary that. But no new phyla, possibly very few or none, most likely none, have arisen since the Cambrian period. We're still working with this suite of this ensemble of life types that arose all at once. So it's a very strange event in the history of life on the earth. Now, this is where I think possibly the Aganya Sutta comes into play, interpreted loosely. It may be that these primitive life forms, these unconscious life forms, self-replicating automatons that were swimming about in the ocean for millions of years, was what the Abhisara beings who are mentioned in the Aganya Sutta, it may be that they took an interest in that. It says that they tasted the oja, the nutritious foam, and maybe looking at what is this. And for a being to be conscious, in Buddhist understanding, what would be required is a previous consciousness being reborn into as part of the an unfolding of the universe. The Abhisara beings were descending and falling from their high state, their Brahma state. They were falling into the earthly plane of existence, and their consciousness got enmeshed with these primitive organisms. And upon doing that, these forms were not adequate to serve as vehicles for the consciousness of these beings. And they began to unfold, and by the force of their karma and the force of their consciousness, they began to unfold these organisms in different directions. And they were caught then in the matrix of biological life. And they lost their consciousness as Brahma beings, but the stream of birth and rebirth continued. And the unconscious impulse was always to seek a more suitable vehicle for consciousness to unfold, to use as a vehicle in the earth. So they experimented in different directions, not in a really conscious way, but in a kind of unconscious striving, pushing in different directions to see how can mind having this impulse to want to have a suitable vehicle on the earth, a suitable material vehicle it can use. So you have experiments like trilobites and dinosaurs, and they fall by the wayside. It ended up being the mammals and the primates that end up being the highest vehicles, the most suitable vehicles. Now, it's at this point that I think is the biggest problem with the creationist view. Because if you have an intelligent designer, if you have particularly if you assume as a Christian or other theist view would have it, that God is omniscient and omnipotent. Why would he waste millions and millions of years playing around with trilobites and dinosaurs? Why not go to fully formed human beings right from the bat, which is, of course, the story in Genesis? But it's not the narrative that's in any way compatible with the fossil record. It doesn't appear to have a basis in reality. Instead, we see a long history of various life forms arising and thriving and then falling away and going extinct. So there's that, and within that framework of evolving and changing life, there is room for a Darwinist mechanics to work within a limit. It doesn't. I think it doesn't explain everything, but it explains a lot. Classic examples are like the long neck of a giraffe. If there's a mutation that this ancestor of the giraffe has a little bit longer neck, he's able to get more leaves to eat than the other giraffes, and so he will likely live longer and pass on more offspring. And over many hundreds of thousands of years, the giraffe species will get bigger and bigger necks. That sort of thing is readily explicable by Darwinian mechanics, but not the sudden arising of all these different phyla of life. It just doesn't work. So there's so far we've dealt with the universe, the first origins of life, and the divergence of life. The last and fourth juncture point that I'd like to touch on, and is perhaps the most speculative of them all, is what happened in the so-called Upper Paleolithic Revolution. This was an event 50,000 years ago when human beings who were already anatomically human, Homo sapiens sapiens by that point, suddenly became very flourishing in technology, developing all kinds of new tools, developing art forms, ritual behavior that we can recognize in the archaeological record. And prior to that, for tens and tens of thousands of years, even though they were fully anatomically human, they just had the same set of very primitive stone tools. They had fire. They didn't seem to have any ritual or art, and they just sort of bumbled along like that for a very long time. And then suddenly there was this explosion. Sometimes it's been called a consciousness explosion, that there was something happened with the human species about 50,000 years ago that set us on this course to develop agriculture and civilization and so on. And again, it was quite sudden. And it's difficult to account for why it happened when it did. Why did human beings just persist for so long in a very primitive state, barely above the animal level, and then all of a sudden they were showing signs of very sophisticated thought, with cave paintings and beautiful cave paintings and sophisticated tools and artistic ornaments carved out of bone and so on. Now there is no real analog to this that I can find directly in the Buddhist texts. There is mythologically, in many world cultures, there is the idea of the culture hero. One that is probably familiar to many of you would be Prometheus in the Greek myth. He was a titan who gave human beings the secret of fire and thereby angered the gods. Zeus and the others, and he was punished for it. And there's similar myths in many cultures around the world of some divine beings who jumpstarts human culture, uh, bringing something like fire or agriculture. In some of the myths, they first bring, they teach human beings how to plant crops and so on. Now, thinking about this, if there was an outside intervention, and if we want to stay within the framework of the Buddhist cosmology, all we can do is speculate and wonder who in the cosmology might have chosen to intervene in this way. Now, with a little bit of research, I discovered that although it's not evident in the Pali texts, in some of the folk religion in Burma and Vietnam and in China, there are beings that intervened in early human history in this way, and they're sometimes identified with Saka. This includes the Jade Emperor of China, the Buddhist, the Chinese Buddhists, when they began to incorporate the Chinese mythology, they identified the Jade Emperor with Saka. And we see in the Pali text, Saka is often intervening in human affairs, usually in a beneficial way, but he's not really portrayed as the founder of human civilization. So that's one candidate. Perhaps it was Saka. I've got a more, maybe a more out of the box suggestion. Perhaps it was Mara. Perhaps Mara. Mara is not to be confused with the Christian devil. He's not intrinsically evil in the same way, but he's fancies himself to be the Lord of samsara, because he lives in the highest heaven. So he's a very high level deva. He lives in the Parinimata Vasavati deva realm, the highest of the sensual heavens. And we see him in the Pali texts interfering with the Buddha, trying to prevent the Buddha from becoming enlightened, because he doesn't want beings to escape from samsara. And this would be this would correspond to Prometheus in the Greek myth, who is a rebel, just like Mara is called a rebel. He was rebelling against the gods. It may be that Mara, in his vainglory, thought he could produce some kind of a civilization on Earth to serve as a vehicle for his sensual, through the expression of his sensual paradisical notions. So he found this primate species and was able to jump-started their culture to see where it would go. Now, this would also be somewhat corresponding to the Christian story in Genesis, where Adam and Eve are living in primitive simplicity in the garden, naked, just living off the fruits of trees and berries and whatnot, just like primitive hominids. And Satan, in the form of a serpent, tempts them to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So he tempts them with knowledge. And by acquiring knowledge, they no longer can exist in their primitive condition, and they have to then earn their living by the sweat of their brow. So that's a very wild speculation. truth is, we don't know what happened 50,000 years ago, but there was some quantum jump in human consciousness at that time. And this is the moment that humans began to really set out on a new course. And if it was Mara, it ended up backfiring on him, of course, because by creating raising human consciousness and allowing the elaboration of culture, it made possible a vehicle for Buddhas to arise and for beings to truly emerge from samsaric existence, which would not have existed before. So that's been a bit of a journey. I've covered a few different moments in the Earth's evolution and tried to put them with some speculation into a Buddhist framework. Don't take anything that I said as being, absolute truth, but hopefully it will give you something to think about and maybe come up with your own ideas. So